The kennel alarm had already been screaming for 6 minutes when Nurse Mara Ellis slid through the locked service door and dropped to one knee beside the military K9. The dog's ribs rose too fast, then too slow. His amber eyes stayed open, but they were no longer focused on the men crowding the pen. One handler had already shoved a thermometer back into his pocket and muttered, "He's done." Another stood with his arms crossed, looking at the clock like time itself could be blamed. 12 days off food, someone said. "We've tried everything." Mara said nothing. She looked at the water bowl untouched in the corner, then at the K9's muzzle, then at the way his paws kept bracing against the floor as if he still expected an order. The dog did not whine. That was the worst part. He was too exhausted to ask for help. "Move the gate," Mara said quietly. The senior handler frowned. "Lady, we're past that." But she was already opening the small trauma pouch clipped to her belt, fingers steady, eyes fixed on the dog's breathing. She didn't ask for permission again. She simply reached into the paper bag she had brought from the hospital cafeteria, broke off a piece of plain boiled chicken, and held it low, close to the floor, close enough that the dog could choose without fear. The room went still. Even the fluorescent lights seemed louder. The K9 turned his head by a fraction. His nose twitched once, then twice. Every man in the room watched the same impossible thing happen. The dog, who had refused water, refused broth, refused every tempting smell for nearly 2 weeks, leaned forward and took the food from Mara's hand. Not from the bowl, not from the handler, from her hand. The sound was tiny. A single chew, then another. But it hit the room like a door opening after days in the dark. One of the handlers straightened so fast his chair scraped the floor. "He hasn't done that for anyone," he whispered. Mara kept her hand still, letting the dog decide the pace. She watched his throat work, watched the first real swallow in 12 days, and only then let herself breathe. But the relief lasted less than a heartbeat. The dog's ears lifted, not toward the handlers, toward Mara. His body shifted, weak but purposeful, and he pressed his muzzle against the inside of her wrist like he already knew her. The oldest handler stared at the scar half hidden beneath her sleeve, then at the way the K9 would not stop looking at her face. "How does he know you?" he asked. Mara did not answer. She only reached for another piece of chicken, slower this time. While outside the kennel, the sound of an incoming vehicle began to rise across the base road, low and heavy, getting closer by the second. What happens when the one calm hand in the room becomes the only one the dog trusts? Mara heard the tires before she saw the vehicle, a heavy government SUV rolling to a stop outside the kennel with its lights off and its engine idling low. Inside, the handlers had gone from mockery to watchfulness, and that shift made the air feel tighter than the locked pen itself. The K9 had started to eat, then stopped again, lifting his head every few seconds as if he expected the moment to vanish. Mara kept her movement small. She broke the next piece of chicken into smaller bites, held it lower, and waited until he chose to take it. One of the handlers stepped closer, but the dog gave a weak, warning huff that made him stop short. Mara did not look up. She only angled her body between the dog and the crowd, using her shoulder and knees to create a narrow, quiet space. That choice changed everything. The K9 followed her lead at once, edging closer to her leg instead of retreating into the corner. Behind the fence, a radio crackled and then cut off abruptly. The oldest handler checked his phone, then looked toward the door with a frown. "They weren't supposed to be here this fast," he muttered. Another set of boots approached from the corridor outside, measured and unhurried. The kennel supervisor opened the service door, then froze as 2 men in dark jackets stepped into view with a folded document case and the posture of people who did not need to raise their voices to take over a room. Mara's hand stayed still on the concrete while the dog pressed closer, one paw shifting against her boot. The first man looked from the animal to the nearly empty bowl, then to the small pieces still resting in her palm. "He's been refusing all intake reports," he said, eyes narrowing. "Why is he eating for you?" No one answered fast enough. The second man's attention dropped to Mara's sleeve, where the scar at her wrist had slipped into view again as she reached for another piece. He noticed it, but he did not speak. Instead, he stepped closer to the kennel gate and read the chart clipped there, his jaw tightening as he tracked the last 12 days, the missed feedings, the failed attempts, the names of every handler who had tried and failed before her. The K9 gave a soft sound and nudged Mara's fingers for more. She offered him one more bite, but this time he hesitated, nose lifting toward the open doorway as the sound of the SUV door shutting echoed across the yard. Then the dog made his decision. He turned away from the handlers, away from the chart, and sat squarely beside Mara's knee as if he had already chosen the only person in the building he trusted. The men in the dark jackets saw it at the same time. One of them reached slowly for the document case, and the supervisor straightened as if bracing for bad news. Mara finally looked up, and the first man said, quiet but sharp, "We need you to come with us right now." Before she could answer, the K9 rose unsteadily and planted himself between her and the gate, watching the door as footsteps gathered outside again. The first man in the dark jacket stepped into the kennel with his palm raised, not gentle, not cruel, just final. "Nurse, step away from the K9. The supervisor straightened at once, relieved to hand the problem to someone else. Mara did not move. She shifted only enough to keep her body between the dog and the door, one hand resting lightly on the rail, the other still open near the bowl. The K9 had stopped eating again. His ears were up. His gaze kept jumping between the men, the open gate, and Mara's face. "He hasn't accepted anyone for 12 days, the supervisor said, as if that settled it. "We can't have him attached to staff when transport is this close." Mara bent slowly, not to argue, but to gather the fallen piece of chicken that had slipped off the tray. She placed it back in her palm and held it out low, not forward, just steady. The dog's nose twitched. One of the handlers scoffed under his breath, but the man in the jacket lifted 2 fingers and shut him down without looking. Mara's eyes moved once across the kennel floor, then to the dog's shoulders, then to the water bowl with the thin ring of film along the edge. She reached over, set the bowl aside, and slid a fresh one from the supply shelf before anyone told her no. The K9 watched every motion. When she returned, she did not speak. She simply crouched, turned her wrist, and let the dog choose. He stepped in, took the food from her hand, and this time he did not pull back. The change was so small no one seemed to breathe for a second. Then the man in the jacket noticed what Mara had noticed a moment earlier. The dog's front paw had been favoring the left side, just slightly, enough to miss if you were only looking at the chart. Mara reached for the clipboard, but the supervisor moved to block it. "You're not on this case," he said. She looked up at him, calm and level, and tapped the kennel latch instead. Then opened the run and let him walk. The room tightened. "If he's hiding pain, keeping him still will make him worse." No one answered, because the dog had already proven her right by standing and shifting his weight away from the back wall. The man in the jacket finally held up the clipboard himself, scanned the notes, and then looked at Mara again like he was seeing the first clean line in a fogged window. "Do it," he said. The supervisor hesitated, but he did it. Mara stayed low beside the threshold and guided the K9 through a slow, careful circle. The animal limped once, then steadied when she matched his pace. He followed her hand without fear, as if her silence gave him room to trust his own body again. Across the kennel, the handlers stopped talking altogether. One of them, the youngest, quietly unlaced the gate to the recovery stall and moved it open before anyone asked. Mara noticed that too, but she did not look up. She crouched beside the dog, checked the paw without pressing too hard, and found the place he had been hiding from everyone else. Not a wound. A splintered nail, buried deep enough to hurt every time he put weight on it. The man in the jacket exhaled through his nose and stepped back. The supervisor's face went pale with the effort of realizing he had nearly sent the dog into transport like this. Mara reached for the kit, but the supply shelf was already being cleared for her. The young handler placed gauze within her reach and then stood aside. No one told him to. That was the first thing that changed. Mara cleaned the paw, wrapped it, and stayed with the dog until his breathing slowed and his head rested against her knee. The kennel alarm had gone quiet, but the louder sound was the one outside. The engine of the government SUV now cut off, footsteps approaching the service door, and a hard knock that made every man in the room turn at once. The man in the jacket looked toward the entrance, then back at Mara, then down at the K9, who had not moved from her side. "Whatever this is," he said quietly, "it just got bigger." By the time the hard knock came again, Mara was already moving. She lifted the bowl with one hand, kept the other low and open, and slid a step sideways so the K9 could choose whether to stay with her or retreat. He chose her. That single decision changed the room. The young handler caught it first and immediately turned away from the dog's flank, giving Mara space without being asked. Outside, the engine noise cut off. Boots crossed concrete. Then a second voice carried through the door, clipped and urgent, demanding a status update on the animal inside. The man in the dark jacket looked at Mara like he had just been handed a problem with too many consequences. "We have to get him cleared for transport," he said. "If this doesn't happen now, the whole schedule shifts." Mara didn't answer right away. She crouched, checked the canine's breathing, then glanced once at the kennel alarm panel still blinking red above the door. The dog had eaten only a few bites, but his body was steadier now, and that mattered more than pride, more than anyone's timetable. She could push him into a crate and make the paperwork easier, or she could hold the line and risk delaying the vehicle outside. It was a small choice in form and a heavy one in cost. She chose the dog. "Not yet," she said, and the words landed quiet but final. The handler swallowed, then nodded once as if something in him had been waiting for permission to trust her judgment. Mara tore open another strip of chicken and lowered it toward the floor, not offering, only waiting. The canine took it from her hand this time, slower, careful, his eyes never leaving her face. The man in the jacket noticed something then, and his attention sharpened so suddenly that even Mara felt it. The dog, who had refused every other person in the kennel for nearly 2 weeks, was now eating beside her boot as if her hand was the only safe thing left in the building. The dark-jacketed man stepped closer, not enough to crowd her, but enough to see what was under the cuff of her sleeve when she reached down. A thin line of old scar tissue crossed her wrist, pale against her skin, and just above it, for half a second, something metallic flashed beneath the watchband before she tugged her sleeve back into place. He saw it. She knew he saw it. He did not speak. That silence was worse than a question. Then the radio on his shoulder crackled, and a voice from outside the kennel said the title Mara had been trying not to hear. The base commander was on site and waiting for an answer. The man in the jacket looked from the radio to the dog to Mara, and the entire room seemed to tighten around that one hidden thing at her wrist. "Who exactly are you?" he asked. Mara kept her hand on the bowl. The K9 leaned into her knee, and before she could decide whether to answer, the service door handle turned from the other side. The handle turned once, then stopped. Everyone in the kennel held still, as if the whole room had been told to breathe through glass. Mara did not move her hand from the bowl. The K9 pressed harder against her leg. When the door finally opened, the man on the other side was not the base commander. He was older, taller, and wearing a plain field jacket with no rank visible at all, but every person in the room stepped back anyway. He looked past the handler, past the locked cage, and straight at the dog eating from Mara's hand like that was the only thing in the world that made sense. "Take him out of the kennel," he said. The handler blinked. "Sir, now." That was the first twist, and it changed the room before anyone understood why. Mara set the bowl down slowly and kept her palm open. The K9 hesitated, then moved with a stiffness that made the young handler curse under his breath. Mara reached for the leash clipped near the gate, but the older man lifted 2 fingers and stopped her. "Not the leash. Your hand." The dog followed her instead, one careful step at a time, and the older man watched that choice like it mattered more than every badge in the building. Outside the kennel, the air was colder and the sound of engines had multiplied. A black SUV was parked by the service road, and behind it 2 military police officers stood at attention beside a transport truck with its rear doors open. Mara had no time to ask a question before the older man pointed at the K9 and then at her. "He refuses everyone except you. That means he is your responsibility until this is sorted." The handler started to object, but the older man cut him off with a look. "You wanted him to eat. Now you are going to help her keep him alive." The payoff came with a weight Mara could feel in her shoulders the moment she nodded. The dog could barely keep his balance, so she shortened the leash, lowered her pace, and guided him toward the open truck ramp while one of the MPs cleared a path without being told. The animal's paws slipped once on the metal floor. Mara caught him before he could fall, then immediately loosened her grip so he would not feel trapped. The older man saw that too. He said nothing, but his eyes narrowed with a recognition he did not yet name. Inside the truck, the light was bright and clinical. A portable medical crate sat open on the bench seat, and a folded blanket marked with a unit emblem had already been laid out, as if someone had expected this exact moment. Mara noticed it, then noticed the older man noticing her noticing it. That was the second shift. He had not come here to ask what was happening. He had come here to see if the rumors were true. The K9 climbed halfway onto the blanket and then stopped, head low, breathing shallow. Mara knelt beside him, checked his gums, then looked up once at the older man. He is dehydrated, stressed, and guarding his mouth, she said. If you force him, you lose him. And if we do nothing, he asked, then you lose him anyway. She reached into the crate, took out a syringe, paused, and held it up for approval instead of using it. The older man gave one short nod, then stepped back and motioned the others to do the same. No one liked being told what to do by a quiet nurse in a locked truck, but no one challenged her either. Mara worked with steady hands, one small decision at a time, while the dog never once took his eyes off her face. When he finally licked the water from her fingers, the older man exhaled like he had been holding his breath for days. Then the radio on his shoulder crackled, and a new voice came through, hard and urgent. The base commander was on the way, and so was the unit that had owned the K9 before he came here. Mara did not look up. She only adjusted the blanket, shifted closer so the dog could lean into her knee, and kept working as the truck doors opened wider and the first shadow of the arriving convoy fell across the floor. By the time the base commander's convoy stopped outside the kennel, Mara had already turned the small truck into something between a treatment room and a shelter. She kept one hand on the K9's shoulder while the other checked his gums, then his pulse, then the uneven rise of his chest, each movement calm enough to steady the men watching from the doorway. The older man in the plain field jacket did not interrupt this time. Neither did the soldiers behind him. They simply waited, because the dog had already decided who mattered. Mara slid a fresh water dish closer, but the K9 only drank when she moved her fingers away first, as if even thirst was taking cues from her restraint. One of the handlers took a step forward, ready to help, and stopped when Mara lifted 2 fingers without looking at him. He obeyed immediately. That tiny pause changed the room more than any salute. It told everyone she was not just treating a sick animal, she was reading him. When she changed the angle of the blanket to ease the pressure on his side, the older man's eyes fell to the worn seam near her wrist where the sleeve kept slipping back. Not a tattoo. Not yet. Something smaller. A faded mark pressed into the skin, the kind that came from a ring, a tag, a wristband worn too long under sweat and sun. He saw it, then looked at her hands again, at the way she positioned the dog's head with the same controlled tenderness used by people who had handled pain before it became urgent. One of the younger men finally asked if the K9 should be moved to the clinic. Mara did not answer right away. She reached for the dog's ear, felt the faint tremor there, and shifted her own body so he would not be left alone while they argued. Not yet, she said at last, and the word carried enough certainty that the suggestion died in the air. The handler who had asked nodded once and stepped back, but now he was watching her like she might vanish if he blinked. A medic from the convoy crouched beside the open door with a clipboard and glanced at the chart, then at Mara, then back at the dog. He had clearly come expecting a simple transfer, a routine pickup, maybe a failed case. Instead, he saw her cut the timeline apart in her head, found the one detail he missed, and quietly handed her the chart without being asked. That was the second shift in the room. Not respect yet, but surrender of control. Mara accepted it with a small nod and used the pencil to mark a dosage change, then another, never once looking proud. She only looked careful. The K9 followed the movement of her hand, like it was the only thing left in the world that made sense. And then, as she set the pencil down, the radio on the commander's shoulder cracked again. A new voice came through, sharper than before, saying the arrival order had been changed, that the dog's former unit had just identified him by name, and that they were asking for Mara specifically. The older man's expression shifted at once. He looked from the radio to her face, then to the wrist she had just hidden again, and this time the silence felt heavier than suspicion. Mara did not react. She only tightened the blanket, lowered her voice for the dog alone, and reached for a small tag clipped inside the crate, a tag no one had noticed until her thumb brushed the edge and made the metal turn. The tag flashed once in the light, enough for the commander to read the old call mark before she closed her hand over it. His breath caught. Outside, Boots hit the pavement in a fast, organized rhythm. Someone was already coming up the steps, and whoever it was had the authority to make this no longer a kennel problem, no longer a medical problem, and no longer something Mara could keep quiet by herself. The K9 lifted his head at the sound, then pressed his nose into her sleeve as if warning her first. Mara turned toward the door, still holding the tag, and the handle moved from the other side. The handle turned again, and this time Mara moved first. She stepped between the K9 and the door, one hand still on the blanket, the other lifting the bowl just enough to keep the dog focused on her instead of the strangers outside. "Easy," she said, not to the men, but to the animal leaning against her leg. The dog obeyed at once, nose dropping to the rim as if her voice had given him permission to keep fighting. That small motion changed the room. The commander saw it and made a decision without speaking. He looked at the two armed guards by the doorway, then at the man in the dark jacket, and finally at Mara. "Everybody out except medical," he said. The jacketed man started to protest, but the commander cut him off with a flat hand. Now, Boots shifted. The kennel thinned. The air grew quieter, but the pressure did not leave it. Mara used the opening to work. She slid a towel under the K9's front legs, adjusted his body, and guided his head onto her thigh while she checked the gum color one more time. The dog's breathing was still rough, but when she pressed 2 fingers to the inside of his wrist, his pulse answered her. She reached into the crate and pulled out the small tag she had found earlier. This time she did not hide it. She held it where the commander could see. He read the worn stamp, then looked at the faint mark on her wrist where the sleeve had ridden up. His face changed, not with surprise now, but with recognition that had arrived too late. He took one step closer and lowered his voice. "That unit was listed as closed." Mara kept her eyes on the dog. "So was I." The commander stared at the tag in her palm, then at the K9. The dog lifted his head, ignored every man in the room, and reached straight for Mara's hand. He touched his nose to her fingers once, then opened his mouth and took the first bite of food he had accepted in 12 days. No one spoke. Even the men at the door stopped breathing for a second. The commander exhaled slowly and did something the others had not expected. He gave Mara the clipboard from his side pocket and let her keep the pen. "Tell us what he needs," he said. Not asked. Told her to lead. Mara did not smile. She only set the bowl down, adjusted the blanket tighter around the K9, and pointed at the crate, then the folded chart, then the door. 2 soldiers moved immediately, exactly where she indicated, carrying out her orders without question. The dark-jacketed man looked as if he wanted to argue with the whole world, but he stayed silent when the commander stepped aside to clear the path. Mara bent closer to the dog, her forehead nearly touching his, and the K9 pressed back, as if he had finally found the one hand he trusted to stay. That was when another sound rolled in from outside, sharp and organized, coming up the steps in a line. The commander turned toward it, then back to Mara, and lowered the clipboard into her hand like a transfer of responsibility that could not be taken back. "Whoever is coming," he said, "they answer to you first." Mara looked toward the door, pin still in her fingers, while the K9 rested his chin on her knee and refused to let go. When the side door finally opened, it did not feel like an arrival so much as a quiet hand reaching into the room and settling every nervous breath. Mara stayed where she was beside the kennel cot, one palm resting on the K9's blanket, the other still near the bowl, as if the motion might be needed again. The first man through the door stopped short, then lowered his eyes to the dog before he looked at her face. Behind him came 2 more, then the base commander, then the medic with the clipped walk and the tired shoulders of someone who had seen too many late nights. Nobody spoke for a moment. The dog did. He lifted his head, watched them all with wary gold eyes, and then turned back to Mara and pressed his muzzle into her wrist. That small movement changed the air. One of the soldiers at the doorway shifted his rifle strap off his shoulder and held it at his side, no longer in a posture meant to take over, but in one that made room. The commander saw the empty bowl, the blanket tucked neatly around the K9's frame, the water cup placed where a trembling mouth could reach it without effort. He did not ask for an explanation. He simply nodded once toward the cot, then to the medic, and the medic answered by setting his bag down and kneeling instead of standing over the dog. Mara slid the chart across the crate top without a word and pointed with 2 fingers to a line she had marked earlier. The medic read it, glanced at the animal, and immediately adjusted the fluid line with a hand that had stopped shaking somewhere between the hallway and that blanket. Outside, boots moved on the pavement. Inside, the room stayed still except for the slow rise and fall of the dog's chest. Then, one by one, the men who had arrived began doing small things without being asked. One filled the water. One pulled a folded towel from his jacket and set it beside the cot. One took the clipboard from the commander and walked it to the desk as if carrying something fragile. None of it was dramatic. That was what made it matter. Mara watched them, said nothing, and reached down to smooth the fur behind the K9's ear. The dog leaned harder into her hand, his eyes half closing for the first time all day. The commander noticed the change before anyone else did. He stepped closer, saw the dog's breathing settle, and then backed away again as if he understood that this part belonged to her. A young soldier near the door had been standing stiffly the whole time, but when Mara lifted the blanket a fraction and tucked it back under the dog's shoulder, he quietly took off his gloves and used them to warm the metal latch on the kennel gate so it would not clang if the dog startled. No one told him to do it. He just did. Mara finally rose, but only enough to reach for the worn military patch that had been sitting on the counter since earlier, the one she had never claimed for herself. She looked at it for a long second, then set it on top of the K9's chart instead of tucking it away. The commander saw that too, and something in his face softened into the kind of respect that does not need words to survive. As the minutes passed, the room changed shape around them. Not louder, not brighter, just steadier. The medic finished his check and stepped back. The commander placed a hand on the crate for one brief second, then removed it as if honoring the dog's space. The soldier at the door held it open while the others filed out, each one glancing back once at the quiet woman beside the cot. Mara did not follow them with her eyes. She stayed with the K9, letting him take the warmth from her hand, letting him rest his chin where he could still feel her pulse. When he finally stirred, he nudged the bowl with his nose, and Mara smiled so faintly it almost disappeared before it was seen. She lifted the bowl again, and this time he ate. Outside, the convoy waited in the cold afternoon light, engines low and patient. Inside, the kennel settled into a hush so complete it felt almost sacred. The commander paused at the threshold, looked back at the scene once more, and quietly signaled for the others to leave the door open. Not because he expected anything more to happen, but because some things should not be closed off once they have finally been given room to heal. Mara kept her place on the floor. The K9 kept his nose near her hand. And as the last of the footsteps faded, the same small bowl that had first started all of it sat between them like an ordinary thing that had somehow become the center of the whole world. Mara did not move far from the kennel floor after the convoy had gone still outside. The room had changed, but not enough to make her leave the place where the dog trusted her hand. She set the empty bowl aside, folded the blanket once with slow, practiced care, and checked the K9's breathing by touch, one finger resting lightly at his ribs while the other brushed the fur at his neck. He watched her every small motion, not with tension now, but with the tired focus of something that had finally stopped bracing for the next disappointment. Near the door, one of the handlers who had spoken the least all day returned with a clean water dish and set it down without a word. Another slid a fresh towel onto the bench and stepped back as if even the sound of his boots might be too much. Mara did not thank them. She only nodded once, the same way she had nodded to the dog all afternoon, and that simple motion seemed to settle the room more than any speech could have. The commander remained at the threshold, hands folded behind his back, watching the K9 take a few more careful mouthfuls before lowering his head again. No one asked for a statement. No one tried to turn the moment into anything larger than it was. Outside, the wind tapped softly against the kennel siding. Inside, the quiet held. Mara reached into the pocket of her scrubs and took out the small packet she had been carrying all day, the one she had opened and closed more than once while waiting for the dog to choose his next step. She scattered a few pieces of food into the bowl, then set one more piece on her palm and held it where he could decide for himself. This time, he ate without hesitation. His nose brushed her skin once before he turned back to the bowl, and the tiny movement carried more certainty than any official report ever could. After that, Mara rose just enough to straighten the blanket beneath him, making sure his shoulders would stay warm. Then she crossed the kennel to check the second cot and the fresh supply bin by the wall, moving on to the ordinary work that still needed doing. One of the younger handlers, who had been standing awkwardly near the back, quietly began refilling the water station beside her without being asked. Another picked up the dropped leash from the floor and hung it back in place with both hands, careful, almost respectful in the way he handled something that had once been treated too roughly. Mara glanced over only once, then went back to work. When she reached the door, she paused just long enough to press 2 fingers lightly against the canine's forehead. He lifted his head a fraction and followed her with his eyes until she stepped outside into the cold air. The kennel door remained open behind her, letting the light spill across the floor where the bowl still rested between them. A moment later, the dog settled down again, his head near the blanket, the last of the food gone. The handler by the wall quietly lowered the radio volume. No one spoke over the sound of the wind. Mara walked toward the next building with the same steady pace she had used all day, one hand in her pocket, the other empty now, ready for whatever small task came next. Behind her, the kennel stayed warm, the bowl stayed clean, and the K9 kept watching the doorway as if he already knew she would return.